There are moments in history that don't begin with a speech, a coup, or a treaty. They start with things so small that no one believes they can carry the weight of the future. A scribbled line, a drop of rain, a child's glance, or a piece of paper no one pays attention to. And then suddenly, that tiny thing pulls an entire country in a new direction, igniting a fire that no great power ever saw coming. The story of Burkina Faso that day was exactly like that. It did not begin in an international hall, nor with a billion-dollar aid package, nor with a long-term strategic plan drafted by corporations. It began with a letter, a clumsy, charcoal-written letter, no envelope, no stamp, no address, just one trembling line rewritten again and again, to the president. The children wrote it under the shade of an old baobab tree, where their classroom existed only through shadows and a few stones gathered to sit on. The paper was stitched from pages of old notebooks, their surfaces smudged and faded. The charcoal came from burnt firewood. The writers were the children themselves, and the one who pieced the final sentences together was their teacher, Zarya, the woman who stood in the red desert believing in miracles. Yet that poor, fragile letter, with its childish strokes, did what hundreds of reports, dozens of investment projects, and thousands of meetings could not do. It made President Ibrahim Traoré stop, not for a few seconds, but with his whole heart. When the letter was placed before him, the morning inside the presidential palace fell into a strange stillness, as if time paused to wait for a great decision. In the meeting room, the ministers were preparing their lists of so-called major issues. They spoke of mining, diplomacy, security, finance, the problems the world believes a nation must solve in order to rise. But all of it suddenly felt distant the moment the children's words appeared before the president. Sir, we study under the sun when it is sunny, and under the rain when it rains. We want a place to sit where we don't get wet, where our papers don't blow away in the wind. That was it. No mention of hunger, no mention of aid, no mention of injustice, just one small wish. A classroom with a roof. But the real question was not what they asked for. It was what the nation was willing to become when it heard that request. A nation can choose to ignore it, as people often ignore voices too small. Or a nation can choose to stop, look toward the ones no one looks at, and ask itself whether the future could begin right where the world has forgotten. What no one in that room knew was that the letter wasn't speaking only to the president, it was speaking to history. It was asking whether Burkina Faso could rise by beginning with its children, with trust, with education, instead of the things people once called power. At that same moment, far away near the border, teacher Zarya was gathering tiny fragments of knowledge to pass on to her students. She had no idea that the lines she helped them form had crossed hundreds of miles, slipped past security gates, entered the center of power, and forced everyone inside to look at themselves. A charcoal letter was worth no money, but it was worth the future, and that is what made it dangerous. It did not knock on an office door. It knocked on the heart of the man holding the nation's destiny. The question then was not whether the president felt moved. It was whether he dared turn that feeling into action. Whether he dared trade billion-dollar meetings, diplomatic agreements, and criticism from great powers for a step toward children no one had ever looked at. And when he stood up and pushed the chair aside, the room froze. The people around him didn't understand what was about to happen. They didn't know his decision would force the entire country to rethink the meaning of strength. The day the letter reached the president was not an ordinary day. It was the day a nation stood at a crossroads. One path led toward listening to the loud voices again. The other led toward a place where even the smallest voice could shake the heights of power. This story begins with a charcoal letter, but it will end somewhere no one expects, with a classroom, a policy, a new generation, and a reminder that the future is sometimes written by the smallest hands. And if you ever believe that small things cannot change great things, the story ahead will make you rethink everything. Stay until the end, because you will decide whether that letter remains a beautiful moment or becomes the spark that opens the future of an entire continent. That morning, the capital city of Ouagadougou woke up to the familiar sounds of a nation trying to rise in a new century. Car horns, hurried footsteps, the loudspeakers of crowded markets calling buyers, everything blended into a rhythm everyone already knew by heart. But inside the presidential residence, that noise could not reach the wide room with the high ceiling where Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk. On the table were thick stacks of documents prepared overnight by his advisors. New mining projects, foreign investment commitments, regional cooperation requests. Everything looked important. Everything spoke about the future of the country through numbers so big they felt almost unreal. At that moment, the door opened quietly. An aide stepped in, holding something completely out of place among the machine-printed files. An old envelope, no stamp, no seal, no sender. Just a line written in charcoal. To the president, the aide didn't dare say anything. He simply placed the letter down, bowed slightly, and left. No one imagined the letter could matter. It wasn't marked urgent, wasn't from any ministry, and wasn't an intelligence document. To most officials, it was just a piece of paper sent improperly from some distant village. But to Traoré, anything that came from the people was worth a pause. He touched the rough edge of the paper, feeling its texture, and the first thing in his mind wasn't the content, but a question. Who wrote it? And how had this letter made it through layers of security to land right here in front of him? He opened it. Inside was not modern paper. It was pages from old notebooks, stitched together with colored threads, probably the kind used to mend clothes. 4 pages, yellowed and dusty. The handwriting was young and clumsy, clearly a child's. He read every line slowly. Dear Mr. President, we are the students of Bulgu village. We study under the sun when it is sunny and under the rain when it rains. Our teachers use stones as chairs and wooden scraps as boards. We only ask for a place to study where we don't get wet. Another line, likely from the teacher, was written smaller, slanted. I am Zarya. I teach 30 children. They are not asking for gifts. They are only asking for a roof to learn under. When he finished reading the 4 pages, the entire room felt squeezed by silence. Traoré placed the letter on the desk, yet his hand stayed on it, as if afraid it might vanish if he let go. In that moment, the multi-million-dollar mining projects lost their voice. The international meetings he had scheduled for the afternoon faded into the background. The only thing still sharp was the image of 30 children sitting under a baobab tree, passing pieces of charcoal to each other as they wrote those words. The meeting with the mining corporation was set to begin in 20 minutes. It was a meeting prepared for weeks. A deal many believed was a golden chance for the economy. But when the aide announced the delegation had arrived, Traoré said only one sentence: cancel the meeting. The room fell silent. The aide thought he misheard. Sir, cancel it? Yes, cancel it and prepare the car. I need to go to Bulgu. The door closed behind him, leaving confusion across the entire residence. A president canceling a national meeting because of a charcoal-written letter, an action that seemed unusual, even reckless. But he did not explain, because the moment he finished reading that letter, he understood something no report had ever been able to say. A nation cannot build its future by abandoning its smallest voices. He walked down the long corridor, sunlight pouring through the tall windows and shining on the letter resting in his hand. And in that moment he realized the true importance was not the size of the problem, but the call of those who had never been heard. Years later, people would ask why a president made such a bold decision over a clumsy letter. But if they had ever seen a child's trembling handwriting saying, "Please see us," perhaps they would understand. Some moments do not require debate. They require a heart that knows when to respond. And that morning, a flame was lit by words written in charcoal. If you think a small letter cannot shake the wheels of power, stay with this story. What happens next is something you will never forget. comment and subscribe to follow the next chapter. Before she became the woman brave enough to write a letter straight to the president, Zarya was just a thin little girl sitting beside an old construction site on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Her father, a quiet bricklayer who couldn't read, had hands strong enough to raise walls through seasons of sun and rain. He often told her something that later became the compass of her entire life. You don't need anyone to see you to be strong. Real strength doesn't need an audience. On dusty red afternoons, when the sun dipped low and the sound of hammering still echoed steadily, Zarya would sit on an overturned bucket, exercise book in her lap, a pencil worn down to her fingertips. She practiced addition problems, simple sentences, and the vague dreams of a child who didn't yet understand the world, but already knew that learning was the only way out of poverty's endless cycle. Her mother passed away early. Her father was both a laborer and a quiet teacher who showed her that persistence mattered more than luck. But from him, she learned something else too. Bricks cannot speak, yet a builder tells stories by choosing each one, placing each corner, correcting each mistake. Teaching children is the same. You don't need fancy bricks. You need patient hands. So when Zarya grew up, her path to school was long but straight. She studied well, fast, and tirelessly. Her grades brought her to good classes, then to a respected high school, and then to the gates of the National University. People called her the shining light of the working district. She was expected to do great things to become a scientist, an expert, a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Education or the National Assembly. But what no one realized was that Zarya never wanted to sit in cold rooms filled with documents and spinning chairs. She wanted to return to the place where learning truly meant something. Not where people talked about education through reports, but where education was still a breath of life. A place where even a beautiful handwriting stroke could make a whole household joyful for a week. That's why on graduation day, while her friends dressed up, took photos, and posted their diplomas online, Zarya quietly turned away. She held an old bus ticket. Destination Bulgu, the small village where her grandmother once lived. A place she had visited once as a child. Too faint to remember, but strong enough to call her back when she grew up. The trip was long. The wheels scraped over patchy roads, dust clouds swallowing the sky. When the bus stopped, she saw no school, no gate, only mud houses along the hillside and a few children playing with rusty can lids. Their eyes looked at her with curiosity mixed with caution. An elderly man, the village chief Ibrahim, welcomed her with a gentle smile and a sad voice. We don't have salaries for teachers, and we don't have a real school. But if you are willing to stay, we can offer you a simple home. She nodded. Without a second of hesitation, Zarya's first classroom was under the shade of an old baobab tree. She used broken wooden pieces as a board, rotten fruit crates as chairs, and cement bag scraps as paper for the children to practice writing. In the first days, their language was clumsy, their curiosity mixed with fear. But she didn't push them. She told stories, taught them sounds, drew numbers in the dirt. Slowly, one by one, they came because she didn't just teach. She made them believe they could learn. What hurt Zarya most wasn't the lack of tools, but the afternoons when she saw the children's futures shrinking in the silence of this land. Some were bright but had no books. Some were diligent but had no notebooks. They learned using the only thing they had left, perseverance. Then one day, after heavy rain soaked all their exercise pages, a small child sitting under the tree asked her, "Teacher, why don't we have a school?" That one question alone was enough to carve into a teacher's heart. That evening, under the dim light of an oil lamp, Zarya opened a worn piece of paper, cut and patched together from scraps of discarded books. She picked up a piece of charcoal and began to write, not because she believed the letter would reach the president, but because she feared that if she didn't write it, the children would think they weren't worth mentioning. She wrote each word slowly, piecing together their voices, their small wishes, the kind every child in the world deserves to have. And before stitching the 4 pages together, she whispered a line only the oil lamp heard. "If someone reads this, please see them." Zarya didn't write the letter to ask for a miracle. She wrote it because she believed silence is also a form of wrongdoing. And sometimes, when even one person dares to step out of silence, an entire nation has no choice but to listen. If Zarya was the heart keeping the flame alive, then the 3 children sitting in the classroom beneath the baobab tree were the 3 small sparks lighting the path for an entire land to change. They were not alike. They came from different backgrounds, spoke differently, lived differently. But when they sat beside one another on those makeshift stones, they formed the truest portrait of a generation that the nation owed a future. And it was these children, through innocent words and trembling handwriting, in a letter to the president, who carved a mark into history that nothing could erase. The first was Kemba, 12 years old, taller than the others, with deep, steady eyes that seemed older than his age. He was the kind of student who arrived very early and left very late. On some afternoons, while Zarya was still packing her board, Kemba would already be there, asking how lungs worked, why blood had different types, asking questions no one in the village could answer. Since he was young, he had understood loss. His little brother died in his arms at only 3 years old because there was no clinic, no medicine, no one who reached them in time. That pain slipped into his life like a permanent mark. But instead of turning grief into bitterness, Kemba turned it into purpose. He told Zarya that one day he wanted to wear a white coat and walk into villages where children no longer died from diseases the world had cures for long ago. In the letter to the president, he wrote a line that made Ibrahim Traoré pause longer than all the others. "We don't want to study on the ground forever." It wasn't a complaint. It was the declaration of a child who understood that knowledge cannot grow when it is blown away by the wind. The second was Lamina, the youngest in the class, 7 years old, small, with feet so used to rocky paths that she never complained. Every morning she walked 4 kilometers to class, sometimes with blood on her feet, yet her face still shone as if pain was something she could leave on the roadside. Lamina always carried a folded piece of paper, a simple drawing of a school with 4 walls, 1 window, and a flag waving in the air. Once Zarya asked her why she always kept the drawing. Lamina answered softly, "Because when I close my eyes, I can see it. So it must exist somewhere." It was Lamina who wrote the line later quoted the most in the cabinet meeting. "I have many things to say, but I need a place to say them." A simple sentence, yet it struck exactly at the wound of the whole nation. Children were not voiceless. No one had ever given them a place to speak. And then there was Thabo, 9 years old, quick, lively, always smiling, his hands always covered in chalk dust. He wasn't the fastest learner or the best writer, but he had a heart bigger than the small village he lived in. After class, when younger children struggled with letters, he sat down patiently, using a stick to draw each stroke in the dirt, fixing every crooked line. He told Zarya he wasn't as smart as Kemba, or as good at drawing as Lamina, but he could help those who were slower, so they wouldn't be left behind. In the letter to the president, Thabo wrote something that made many adults blush. "We don't need gifts. We need a classroom to grow up in. Not to become doctors or engineers, but to become ourselves." The words adults often call childish carried a purity sharp enough to be painful because they said what no one dared say. Children do not need pity. They need the conditions to rise. These 3 children were not 3 separate stories. They represented all the generations that had grown up in silence, where dreams were pieced together from discarded scraps, where the future was drawn in charcoal, where knowledge fought against weather, hunger, and indifference. And from these places where nothing seemed possible, the strongest light often shines. They had no idea their handwriting rested in the hands of the man holding the nation's fate. They had no idea their simple words would make a president cancel a billion-dollar meeting just to meet them. They wrote because they believed that if they did not speak, no one would know they existed. These 3 children are a reminder that the future never begins in grand halls, but in the places forgotten for the longest time. And when these small voices are finally heard, an entire nation must rethink its path. Stay with this story, because what happens next will be the moment that forces an entire government to stand up and look at itself. That morning, the large meeting room inside the presidential residence was prepared the same way it always was for important government sessions. Leather chairs lined up neatly, the large screen ready to present a mining project worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and ministers walking in with stern faces, believing they were about to discuss matters considered central to the nation. No one knew that in the president's hand at that moment was not the agreement they had spent weeks preparing, but 4 thin, worn pages stitched together with red thread. The letter from Bulgu, the charcoal-written letter. When Traoré entered, the whole room stood. He nodded slightly and sat down. No opening remarks as usual, no agenda announcement, no updates, only a long silence that made the ministers glance at one another in confusion. Then he placed the letter on the table, gently. Yet, when it touched the wood, the sound echoed, like a heavy strike that made the entire room hold its breath. Minister Traoré, the voice of the pro-economy faction, spoke first. His tone was thick and troubled. "Sir, we have an important meeting with a major mining partner. I hope the reason for cancelling this morning's session is tied to a strategic matter for the nation." Traoré didn't answer immediately. He simply opened the letter and set it where everyone could see. Childlike handwriting, smudged charcoal marks, torn edges patched together, clearly not what anyone in the room expected. Some ministers frowned, a few sighed, some even let out a short laugh, as if they were witnessing something too trivial to care about. The finance minister spoke slowly. "With all due respect, sir, this is a letter from children. A baobab tree cannot replace billions in investment. We cannot let emotions interfere with national work." A tiny sound followed. The president's pen hit the table, a small signal of what was coming. He looked directly at the finance minister and asked, "Have you ever been to Bulgu?" Silence stretched. Then the minister answered, "No." He turned to the education minister. "And you?" "I haven't either, sir." Then to the Minister of Regional Development. "And you?" "I've been to many provinces, but not that one." "If you not laces the very says." And so it went one by one. Every member of his cabinet, the people planning the future of the nation, admitted they had never once stepped foot in the village where 30 children were studying under a tree. Traoré set his pen down. His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold and sharp. "Yet you are telling me you understand this country's future better than the children who are living it." No one spoke. He lifted the letter, looking at it the way one looks at the heart of a problem that power has ignored for too long. "This is not a letter. This is a national report, written in flesh and blood. It is more honest than any statistic you send me each month." Another minister tried to recover the room. "Sir, we are all moved, truly. But tell us, if we respond to this letter, then tomorrow another village will write, and another, and hundreds, thousands more. We cannot build schools simply because of a few sheets of children's paper." Traoré stayed silent. But it was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of someone who had just uncovered the truth. He asked slowly, each word hitting the room, "So we are not building schools because we lack money, or because we don't want to hear the voices of places without power?" The crowded room suddenly felt as if only the president's breath remained. The Minister of Regional Development lowered his voice. "Sir, if you go to Bulgu, the international press will mock you. They will call you populist, unstrategic. You will lose favor with investors." Traoré looked at them for a long time. Then he said a sentence that many later recorded as the compass of his entire term. "A nation is not built by what outsiders think of us, but by how we treat the weakest among us." Finally, he stood, holding the letter. "I did not ask for your opinion to decide. I am informing you so you know I am going." He turned and walked out. The heavy door closed behind him, leaving a room full of ministers staring at each other in confusion, while before him the road to Bulgu opened. A clash between two visions had begun right in the capital. One side wanted everything to stay the same. The other wanted change from the very roots. And no one realized that this very moment had triggered a movement no force would be able to stop. That morning in Bulgu began like any other. The early sun was still soft. A gentle wind brushed across the clay roofs, carrying with it the red dust of the borderlands. Under the baobab tree, Zarya had arrived early to prepare for class. The children gathered, their footsteps light, but their eyes full of excitement as always, even though nothing was new except the same old planks and two makeshift boards propped up by stones. No one in the village knew that in just a few hours their familiar world would shake in the most beautiful way. While the children repeated the first letters of the day, a strange sound drifted in from afar. At first, it was faint, like insects fluttering their wings. Then it grew louder and louder until the ground beneath them began to tremble. Lamina was the first to look up. "Teacher, the ground is shaking." Zarya froze for a moment. That sound wasn't from a cart or a tractor. It was steady, heavy, rhythmic, like metal striking the earth. And then, on the horizon, dust began rising, thick and wide like a moving cloud. The children held their breath. That cloud was coming closer. Very close. When the convoy finally emerged, every sound in the village disappeared. No one had ever seen so many armored vehicles and escorts. 4 black jeeps, gleaming, moving slowly, but with overwhelming presence. A boy whispered, "Is it the army?" Another trembled. "Is something bad happening?" But what stunned everyone wasn't the convoy. It was the moment the door of the first jeep opened and a man stepped out, not wearing a uniform, not wearing medals, not wearing polished shoes, just a simple white shirt, dust-covered shoes, a young face with eyes carrying the weight of a nation. A child whispered, Is that the president?" And when Zarya recognized the face she had only seen in the rare news broadcast she caught, her heart pounded as if a door had opened inside her. Yes, it was him. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, a man who could have been in grand halls, meeting world leaders, signing billion-dollar agreements, but today he wasn't in the capital, not in the presidential palace, not in front of cameras. He stood before them, in the red dust, beneath the old baobab tree. The entire village held its breath. No one dared step forward. No one knew whether to bow, salute, or say anything at all. Traoré solved the confusion with an action no one expected. He walked straight to the group of children. And before the stunned eyes of the whole village, he didn't stand above them. He didn't hold himself like a man of power. He didn't allow his guards to shield him. He slowly bent down and sat on the ground, right in the circle of the barefoot children. Zarya brought her hand to her mouth. She could not believe what she was seeing. A president, the head of the nation, sitting in the dirt, in the red dust, among barefoot children. Traoré looked at each child. His eyes weren't those of a leader on an inspection. They were the eyes of someone who truly wanted to understand, who wanted to listen. Kemba was the first to speak. "Sir, did you really read our letter?" Traoré nodded. "Every word?" Lamina clutched the folded paper in her pocket, the drawing of a school, as if she was afraid that if she didn't hold it tight, the dream would disappear. She stepped forward and asked, "You came to talk to us?" "No," the president said, his voice low and warm. "I came to listen. If you wanting to writers." Those words broke the air open, simple, quiet, but heavier than any speech. The children began to talk. They talked about lessons cut short by rain, about days so hot the charcoal melted on the page, about tiny dreams so big they didn't know how to describe them. And Traoré sat silently, hands resting on his knees, leaning forward listening to every tiny sound. Zarya stood behind them, her eyes burning but refusing to cry. She had never imagined that one day the words spoken under this tree would be heard by someone with the power to change everything for these children. When they finished, the president looked at Zarya for a long moment. Teacher, you have done everything a person can do when they have nothing. Zarya bowed her head gently. I only did what I had to do. Traoré stood, but instead of giving promises, he walked toward the jeep. A guard opened the back. Inside were wooden crates, but he didn't show them yet. Not now. Not when everyone was still overwhelmed by his very presence. He turned back to the children. The future of this nation begins here. From the soil beneath your feet, from this baobab tree, from your voices. And I will stand with you. The village fell silent. No applause. No cheering. Just a strange feeling, as if a massive door had opened and light was rushing in. When the convoy stopped in Bulgu, many villagers didn't understand what was happening. But for the children who wrote the charcoal letter, it was the day they saw something generations before them never had. The most powerful man in the country came, and he sat on the ground to hear them speak. What happened next is something you will not want to miss. The morning after the president's visit, Bulgu woke up with a strange feeling. Not just because of the convoy that had appeared the day before, but because of something no one could see. Something in the air had shifted. The children woke earlier, washed their faces faster, and ran to the baobab tree even before the sun rose. Zarya did the same. She had never felt her hands tremble the way they did that morning, not from exhaustion, but from a hope she had buried for years, now rising like an underground spring. No one in the village knew exactly what would happen after yesterday's meeting. A president had come, sat on the ground, and listened to children as if they were strategic advisors. That alone had kept the whole village murmuring through the night. But no one dared hope too much. People were used to having hope blown away like the red dust. But before the sun reached its peak, the sound of metal clanking, heavy engines, and voices calling to one another echoed from the entrance of the village, shattering all hesitation. Large trucks appeared, not armored vehicles like the day before. These carried construction materials, cement bags, timber, steel, water pipes, rolls of electrical cable. Even a brand new water tank. The children
ECOWAS breakaway states
Zarya
of Burkina
covered her
Faso and Mali.
She had never seen so many materials in her life. A tall man, skin darkened by sun and years of labor, jumped down from the first truck. He set his fabric hat aside and smiled widely. We're here to build a school. The words struck Zarya's chest like lightning from a clear sky. But the greatest surprise was behind the trucks. A group of laborers, not from the capital, not the official government crew. Most were skilled workers from other provinces, men who had grown up in villages like Bulgu, some who had studied under straw roofs, some who never had a school at all. They hadn't come only because the president ordered it. Something in the letter had made them remember their own childhoods. The work began immediately. No meetings, no debates, no waiting, only action. Zarya stood beside the children, watching the first shovels break the earth. The dry ground cracked open, dust rising, but this was the dust of beginnings. The men measured land with string they brought themselves, planks were laid down as markers, cement was mixed on the spot. Everyone worked with a speed that left the village stunned. At first, the children only watched. They didn't dare approach, thinking this was work for grown-ups, for people who knew more. But then Thabo ran forward, picked up a small brick, and placed it in Kemba's hand. We can help too. Thank you, Sian, Hazan Savraj. In that moment, a new flow began. One by one, the children formed a line, passing small bricks from hand to hand like a game. Lamina, with her tiny hands, held each brick as if it was something sacred. Her face was flushed from the sun, but her eyes glowed like sparks. An older worker noticed them and laughed softly. Good, keep going. The future of this school is in your hands. That simple sentence filled the children with strength. They ran back and forth, carrying materials, bringing water, gathering dirt, each wanting to contribute to the first school they had ever dared to dream of. Zarya watched, eyes narrowed against the sunlight, but her heart held a feeling she had never known. For years she had taught them that knowledge could change the world. But today, She watched them change their own reality with their small hands. The entire village began to move. Mothers brought water for the workers. Fathers cleaned the construction area. Young men who had never held a shovel stood in line to learn how to mix cement, how to measure foundations, how to raise walls. Bulgu became the largest construction site in its own history. No orders, no assignments. People helped simply because they felt they should. By afternoon, the sun cast its light on the first standing walls. The cement was still wet, the workers' hands covered in white dust. The children sat under the tree, staring at the rough structure with hearts trembling as if they were witnessing a miracle. Thabo whispered, "Teacher, it's a real wall, not just a drawing anymore." Zarya knelt beside him. "Yes, this is the first time your dreams stand upright." As the sun set, the last hammer strikes echoed like the closing notes of an unofficial ceremony. The children didn't want to go home. The whole village didn't want to leave. They stood watching the raw walls as if they were looking at a future they had never dared to claim. That night, outside her doorway, Zarya opened the letter the children had written. She placed her hand over the charcoal lines, and for the first time in her life, she believed her prayer had gone the right way. Not because a miracle had fallen, but because someone had listened, and because an entire village had risen. Stay with the story. The next chapter brings an unexpected event that will show everyone that building a school isn't just about building walls, but building hope. In the middle of the busy construction days, when the cement still carried its fresh scent and the sound of hammering echoed like the heartbeat of Bulgu, there was an empty space that only Zarya noticed more clearly than anyone else. The seat at the end of the row, a flat wooden plank laid across two stones, remained untouched. No one sat in it. No child dared move it. It was Malaku's seat. If Kemba was reason, Lamina was hope, and Thabo was heart, then Malaku was the silence of an entire generation. A boy so quiet that people sometimes forgot he was sitting right there. But his silence wasn't laziness or shyness. It was the silence of a soul that had seen more than his age should ever allow. Malaku came to class earliest and left last, not to seek attention, but because under the baobab tree he found something no other place gave him. There his silence was heard. And words were the only way he knew to speak to the world. Then one day he didn't show up. The first morning without him, Zarya thought he might be tired, or perhaps his family needed help. But by the second day, then the third, his absence became a quiet wound inside her. When the children lined up to read, their eyes often slid toward the empty seat, like a missing note in a melody they had grown used to. By the second week, Zarya couldn't take it anymore. She went to look for him. She searched from one end of the village to the other, asking every person, every home. But the answers were avoided, heavy, as if the village was trying to hide a shared scar. Finally, village chief Burama told her in a low, heavy voice. Malaku's family left during the night. There was gunfire in the neighboring village. They ran to survive. Zarya's whole body seemed to collapse, not just because a student was missing, but because it reminded her that this land wasn't only poor, it was fragile in the face of violence and turmoil. That night, under the flickering oil lamp, Zarya stared at the empty seat and wondered if anyone would ever return to sit in it. She didn't know that far away in the capital, when President Traoré reviewed the list of students sent from Bulgu, his eyes stopped at a small blank space between the names, a single line with no attendance mark. Malaku. He looked at the children's letter preserved in the file. He remembered their words, remembered how Zarya described each student, remembered how the children's faces lit up when they mentioned their friend. He said nothing to anyone, but the disappearance of a child in the middle of a school being built kept him awake at night. The next morning, he called an aide. "I want to know where Malaku is." But sir, finding a family that fled in the night, he cut him off. "If we build a school but lose a child, then that school is just a shell. Go find him." It wasn't an order from a president. It was a request from a man who understood that the future of a nation is written by children, not by numbers. 3 days later, news arrived. Malaku's family was sheltering in a small village 30 kilometers from Bulgu, a temporary hut crowded with 3 other families. His mother had been slightly injured during their escape, and Malaku, according to the messenger, had not spoken a single word since the night they fled. The president didn't send a message. He sent a car, the same car that had brought him to Bulgu the first time. When the car reached the village, the soldier who stepped out carried no weapon, no authority, only a message as soft as the wind. Your teachers in Bulgu kept your seat for you. Would you like to go back? Malaku stood behind his mother, dark eyes deep like a lake, disturbed too many times. He didn't answer, but when the soldier added that the seat was still waiting, he lifted his head, just that small movement. But it said everything. It was the lift of a child who had just realized he was not forgotten. The car returned to Bulgu late in the afternoon. The children waited at the construction site as if welcoming a brother coming home. When the door opened, Malaku stepped out thinner than before, hair messy, eyes still sad but glowing with the faintest light. Zarya ran to him, knelt, and embraced him. I kept your seat. Many prediction for 22. Malaku whispered. They told me it was still waiting. That evening, as the sun set behind the first standing wall, Malaku sat in his seat again. His hand touched the wooden surface, stroking it gently, as if touching a promise he once believed he would never hear. And the whole class applauded. No instructions. No cue. Because the return of a child is the most beautiful proof that a community has begun to heal. That night, under the baobab tree, Zarya sat alone, looking up at the sky. She knew a school needed bricks, steel, and labor. But what made her believe more than anything was this. For the first time, a child had not disappeared into silence. A nation begins to heal the moment its weakest are no longer left behind. That morning, the sky over Bulgu was an unusual shade of blue. Not the pale blue of harsh sunny days, nor the dull gray of storm-heavy weather. It was a deep, vivid blue, as if announcing that what was about to happen would not be just a ceremony, but the moment that opened a new era for this land. In front of the new school, villagers had gathered since dawn. Mothers wore their finest traditional cloths, outfits they reserved only for life's most important days. Fathers straightened their collars, awkward and unsure, as if preparing for an experience they themselves had never had. The children ran around excitedly, touching the new walls, brushing their hands along window frames still smelling of fresh paint. The small school with one classroom, a bright tin roof, and wide windows stood in the middle of the village like a miracle made real. No tall gates, no shiny signboard, but to Bulgu it was more beautiful than any palace in the capital. Zarya stood at the classroom door, hands clasped tightly to steady herself. Her dress wasn't new, but it had been washed carefully, dried overnight so it carried the scent of morning sun. Her hair was tied more neatly than usual, yet her eyes still revealed the hesitation of someone unused to standing before something so enormous. She had never imagined she would live to see this day. Every eye turned to the road leading into the village. Soft whispers, restless waiting, a quiet, swelling excitement floating in the air. And then, finally, the familiar sound of engines echoed, not bringing surprise this time, but confirmation. President Ibrahim Traoré had returned. The convoy moved slowly, without noise or show, as if it too understood that today was not a day for power, but for children. When the door opened and the president stepped out, Bulgu did not cheer. No one pushed forward. The entire village simply stood still in a wordless respect, like people standing before something sacred that the heart naturally falls quiet for. Traoré looked at the school before him. He didn't hide his emotions. A small classroom, yet steady and strong, standing on the foundation of hearts that had waited far too long. He turned to Zarya and smiled gently. You kept your promise to the children. Zarya answered, her voice trembling but clear. It wasn't me who kept it. It was the nation. The ceremony began without any grand ritual, no long speeches, no camera backdrop, just a red ribbon tied between two wooden stakes. When the president handed the scissors to Zarya, she turned to the children. "Who wants to help me cut the ribbon?" All of them did. But it was Lamina who looked up, eyes shimmering, her hand rising timidly as if afraid the dream would vanish when she touched it. Zarya took her hand. "Let's do it together." Thanks for watching. The ribbon split with a sound so soft it was barely heard, yet that softness carried the weight of a door opening. The children burst into the classroom like water rushing through a river mouth after a long drought. Some touched the desks, some ran their hands over the board, some sat down and instantly stood back up, unable to believe the seats truly belonged to them. Laughter erupted like fireworks. Fabo ran to his desk, sat down, stood up again, then sat down once more, unable to believe this seat was his and no one would take it away. "Teacher, this chair is real." Lamina placed her drawing on her desk and whispered as if speaking to her own secret. "It looks exactly like the one in my picture. Exactly." But the moment that made the whole class fall silent was when Malaku walked in. He didn't run, he didn't smile, he simply walked slowly, carefully, to the desk in the corner. The desk kept for him, waiting for him. He placed his hand on its surface and closed his eyes. The class held its breath with him. And, in that moment, everyone understood. Sometimes the return of a child matters more than the presence of a head of state. The president stood outside the window, watching. He didn't interfere. He didn't speak. Because he understood the heart of a school doesn't come from the words of adults, but from the eyes of children when they realize their future has just become real. And then came the final moment of the ceremony. Zarya lifted a small bell, not a modern one, a bell she had requested from an abandoned church near the border. She raised it and turned to the president. "Would you like to ring the first bell, sir?" Traoré shook his head. "This bell isn't mine, it belongs to the children. If the views and 80 from Bastinges they too." Zarya looked at them. "Who wants to ring the bell for the new school year?" Every hand rose. But it was Malaku, once the quietest of all, who stepped forward. He took the rope, inhaled deeply, and pulled hard. The sound rang out across the morning, across rooftops, across fields, reaching even the places where people believed hope could never echo again. The first bell of Bulgu's school, the first bell of a new generation. The bell reminding everyone that a charcoal-written letter could shatter the walls of indifference and open the doorway to the future. To this day, the people of Bulgu say they don't need to record that date in history because the sound of that bell still rings in their memory like a light that will never fade. Stay with the story, because what happens after the inauguration will go far beyond the building of a school. It will reach the capital, the government, and become a policy that reshapes an entire nation. From the moment the first bell rang in Bulgu's new classroom, everything that followed did more than change a village. It quietly began to flow into the bloodstream of the entire nation. No one knew the exact moment the transformation started to spread. Some said it began with the sparkling eyes of Lamina as she opened her first new book. Others said it started with Traoré's firm nod during the next cabinet meeting. But no matter where it began, everyone understood one thing. Bulgu was no longer just a small dot on the map. It had become a symbol. Just 1 week after the inauguration, a special meeting was held in the Ministry of Education's main hall. The same people who once doubted the president's decision now sat silently, as if waiting to hear a truth they could no longer deny. Minister Nzon stood before the screen where the image of Bulgu's school glowed simple yet vibrant. No big courtyard, no lab, no modern technology. But it had what many other education models were still missing: dignity, belief, and the courage of a community that dared to trust that knowledge is a right, not a privilege. The minister opened with a sentence that froze the entire room. "This is not the school of one village. This is the future of the nation. Make her herding fast is nood of presence safe." He presented the report in a calm voice, though his eyes were sharp. Attendance in Bulgu had increased by 100% in just 3 weeks. Children who once studied under the sun now arrived even earlier than students in the capital. The spirit of the entire village had changed. Neighboring regions were already asking how they could do the same. A new plan appeared on the screen. The words flashed in bold, "Blueprint Bulgu." No one spoke. No one opposed it. Because for the first time in years, they saw a plan that began from real life, from soil, from breath, from the people, not from air-conditioned offices or keyboard theories. Traoré sat in the front row, hands clasped. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, he simply watched, like a father seeing his child stand on its own for the first time. The Bulgu blueprint had 4 pillars. Build simple yet durable classrooms, designed for dry, hot regions, easy to assemble, easy to repair. Build housing for teachers, so people like Zarya wouldn't have to cross several villages just to find shelter. Support food and school supplies for children in the hardest hit regions. And most importantly, deploy mobile satellite classrooms, units that could travel deep into remote areas where children had never seen a blackboard or a stick of chalk. When the minister reached the final section, he turned directly to the president. "Sir, if we do this, the country will have to change from its roots. There is no silence heavier than the silence that waits for a decision." But that day, the decision came quickly. Traoré stood. It's time for change. The room released a collective breath. No more hesitation, no more debate, only action. In the weeks that followed, trucks rolled out to distant lands. They carried no weapons, no intimidation. They carried bricks, books, and hope. The schools they built didn't all look the same. Some used fired bricks, some used wood, some had only a tin roof but strong concrete floors and wide windows. But they all shared the same soul, the belief that knowledge belongs in the hands of the people. In a northern village, children learned for the first time in a classroom cooled by solar-powered fans. In a distant western settlement, a young teacher taught math using a blackboard mounted on a cart. And in the southern desert, mobile classrooms unfolded like tents, ready in just a few hours. No one expected the Bulgu model to spread so quickly. But what shocked people more was not the speed of construction, it was the speed of transformation. Children who once feared speaking now recited lessons proudly in their schoolyard. Parents who thought reading was a luxury now attended evening classes to learn how to write their own names. And then a story spread across social media, making the Bulgu blueprint a continental conversation. A group of students from another village wrote to the president, beginning with a line identical to the children of Bulgu. "We also want to see our future inside a classroom with a roof." Letters like that began to arrive more and more. Not complaints, awakenings. At an international conference, when a journalist asked Traoré why he devoted so many resources to small rural schools, he replied, "Because no nation becomes strong by abandoning its children." The sentence spread beyond the conference hall onto newspapers, onto social media, and became a reminder that sometimes the turning point of a nation doesn't begin with major agreements, but with an old baobab tree and a dusty classroom. The Bulgu blueprint was no longer just a model. It became a declaration that Burkina Faso had chosen a different path, a path of education, a path of presence, a path of listening. And that path began with charcoal written lines from 30 children beneath a tree. As the sun sets today, behind the clay rooftops of Bulgu, you can still hear children reading from classrooms that only a few years ago existed solely in imagination. Each turning page, each piece of chalk tapping the board, each burst of laughter echoing from the windows, every sound retells a story no one here ever wants to forget. Because everything began with something so simple it's almost unbelievable. A letter written in charcoal. A teacher who refused to stay silent. And a leader brave enough to walk away from billion-dollar meetings just to listen to the voices of children no one knew. Bulgu is no longer a name buried under the red border dust. It has become a symbol of how a nation can shift its destiny. From a small corner on the map, one village forced an entire country to confront the most fundamental question of all development. Who are we building the future for? For the numbers in reports or for the living, breathing people behind them? This afternoon in the classroom, warmed by golden sunlight, Malaku sits reading his own writing. Zarya stands at the doorway, looking at the desks and chairs now filling the room, remembering the nights she wrote letters by oil lamp hands trembling, hope too fragile to name. The most moving part is not the strong walls or the wide windows. The most moving part is that the silence is gone. Children who once feared speaking now raise their hands. People who once felt invisible are now written into national policy, and new letters keep arriving. No longer in charcoal, but in pencil, pen, even tablet screens provided by the new education program. Yet they all carry the same message. The ECOWAS breakaway states of Burkina Faso and Mali want to see the light. When the dream of one village becomes the blueprint of a nation, the story has already crossed the borders of Burkina Faso. It has become a lesson for others, a reminder to anyone holding power, that sometimes the answer lies where no one is looking. That a child can point to the cracks of an entire system with a single small question. That greatness does not always begin in grand halls. Today, if you stand in Bulgu in the late afternoon, you'll see drones carrying books across the sky, flying from school to school like birds delivering knowledge. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the echo of the first school bell ringing back from memory, reminding us that real change always begins with one small step. This is not the story of a village, not the story of a president, not even the story of a teacher or 30 children. This is the story of everyone who believes that light can begin in the darkest places. And now, if you are hearing these words, the journey continues, not in Bulgu, not in the capital, but right where you're standing. Let this story live on by showing the world we do not forget, the children standing under the sun, waiting for a roof. Leave a comment if your heart touched even one moment in this journey. And subscribe so we can keep writing the next chapters together, so no small voice is ever left behind. The story doesn't end here. It has only just begun.